They had gathered under a sky the color of wet iron, the smell of salt and wood smoke settling low over the crowd. Every man in that assembly knew the rules, but no one expected the word to be spoken so soon, so openly. It came from the accuser's mouth like a blade drawn in silence, Rager, a single syllable, carried on the cold air, heavy enough to crush a life. The man accused froze, his jaw clenched, his eyes searching the faces around him, already finding none that would meet his gaze. The Viking court was packed that day. Warriors shifted their weight, fingers closing around sword hilts not because they were ordered to, but because the law invited it. Everyone here understood the stakes. 3 paths lay before him, and everyone was a cliff edge. He could leap forward and kill his accuser on the spot, washing away the word in blood before it could take root. He could refuse to fight, let the insult cling to him, and accept a slower death, the suffocating collapse of his social life. Or he could choose outlawry, abandoning land, kin, and protection, doomed to wander until hunger or an enemy ended him. No fourth option existed. The law didn't care whether the accusation was true. Truth was irrelevant, in Viking eyes. Rager did not just mean passive in bed. It was a verdict on a man's entire being, his courage, his worth, his place among those who counted as real men. A man branded with that word was no longer a warrior, no longer someone whose oath held weight. He was a shadow, a contaminant. And the verdict could be delivered in an instant, without trial. The Gragas law codes cold, precise, and as sharp as steel made it plain, anyone called Rager could strike down the speaker without facing punishment. But hesitation, even a heartbeat too long, meant the insult became truth in the eyes of the law. Around the accused, the court murmured. Not in pity, there was none of that, but in anticipation, like gamblers watching the toss of dice. Did he stand too far back from his accuser? Did his hand twitch toward his weapon quickly enough, in a society where masculinity was the highest currency? These moments were public executions without blood yet. The accused's breath came faster. He knew the stories. He'd heard them in the smoky corners of the longhouse, the warrior who killed his own shield brother over a drunken joke about swimming together, the cousin who slit a relative's throat because of a half-heard remark about a torn shirt. These were not cautionary tales. They were precedents, taught like legal principles. In Viking culture, manhood was not a fixed state, it was a performance. Fragile as ice in the spring sun, one wrong word, one wrong gesture could undo years of reputation. And that day, in the packed thing, under the flat gray sky, one wrong word had been spoken. The accused's hand went to the hilt of his axe. He had seconds to decide whether to kill a man in front of the entire community, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but because the law told him that to not kill would be to accept the truth of the insult. Somewhere behind him, someone shifted in the crowd. The scrape of boots on frozen earth sounded deafening. If he swung now, he could keep his property, his name, his right to speak in court. If he hesitated, even to think of the consequences, it would all be gone before the sun set. Somewhere, a raven called. The thing waited. In Viking law, there were only 2 kinds of men, those who penetrated and those who were penetrated. It didn't matter if the act was consensual or forced, real or imagined. In the eyes of the law, the moment suspicion took root, your status shifted forever. On one side of the divide stood the Karlar real men who dominated in bed, in battle, and in every arena of life. On the other were the Urgi, those considered passive, penetrated, and therefore stripped of full citizenship. Once the label stuck, your life, as you knew it, ended. A man branded Urgi lost his property rights. His testimony in court was worthless. His children could be enslaved. His kin could disown him without shame. And there was no appeal because the system was not designed to correct mistakes. It was designed to make examples. The terms were exact, their consequences brutal. Rager unmanly was the nuclear option, the one that demanded immediate violence. Stroden you sexually carried the same weight. Sordin, one who was penetrated, was also a legal death sentence. These weren't playground insults. They were coded triggers that unlocked the right to kill, codified in the same law books that govern trade and property boundaries. The Gragas Code, written in the chill precision of medieval Iceland, devoted entire sections to these words, page after page listing sexual insults, their definitions, and the proper response, which was almost always blood. 16 pages in all. 16 pages where the law didn't talk about theft, or taxes, or land disputes, but about the exact wording that could destroy a man in the space of a breath. And there were layers. If you combine certain terms, say, Roger with an insult about a man's beard, you weren't just questioning his masculinity. You were attacking his age and status. The law called for double compensation in silver, or, more commonly, double the bloodshed. These rules didn't stay locked in dusty manuscripts. They were lived every day, repeated in the sagas like prayers, taught to boys as part of becoming men. Saga after saga told of friends turned killers over a word muttered in jest. Gudmund killing his shield brother for suggesting they had bathed together. Thorstein stabbing his cousin for mentioning a torn shirt that bared his chest. These were not crimes in Viking eyes. They were necessary acts of self-preservation in a society where one slip of the tongue, your own or someone else's, could exile you from humanity. The man at the thing knew all of this. Every person there did. That was the brilliance and the cruelty. Of the system, no one could claim ignorance. The law lived in the air they breathed, as sharp and unforgiving as the sea wind off the fjord. And so, when an accusation like Roger was spoken aloud, it was more than a personal insult. It was a public signal that the accused's place among men was already collapsing unless he acted instantly to stop the fall. That was why no one stepped forward to calm the situation. Why no mediator tried to speak. The rules were older than the men who stood there, older than their fathers. The line between man and ergi was a fault line running through the heart of Viking society, and it was about to crack open again. The accused's fingers tightened on his axe haft. The crowd leaned forward as if drawn by some invisible tide, waiting to see which side of the divide he would choose to stand on. The danger wasn't just in the words, it was in the watching. Every man became a hunter and prey at the same time, scanning the movements, gestures, and voices of the men around him for anything that could be twisted into accusation. A shoulder held too loosely, a voice cracking during a battle cry, standing too close to another warrior when you didn't have to. Even grief could betray you. If you wept too openly at your father's funeral, someone might whisper that you were soft. That whisper could reach the wrong ears, and then just like that, your life was over. The result was a society where men performed masculinity every waking moment, and not just on the battlefield. They thickened their voices deliberately, forcing a rasp into their throats. They grew beards not out of fashion, but as armor because the beardless were easy targets for slurs. They practiced walking with hips locked and knees slightly bent, a calculated stiffness meant to keep their gait from looking too fluid. Some even scarred their own faces deep, deliberate marks carved with knives to appear more violent, more unapproachable, more safe from suspicion. The scar became proof this man had been in the kind of fights only a real man could survive. But the true brilliance of the system, if cruelty can be called brilliance, was that it required no enforcers. The laws didn't need a police force. Every man was his own executioner, and the executioner of others. They had to be. Allowing suspicion to linger was dangerous. If you didn't respond to a questionable gesture or rumor, it looked like you were willing to live with the stain. The sagas record the bloody results. Gudmund killing his shield brother because of a joke about swimming together. Thorstein stabbing his cousin because someone mentioned a torn shirt that showed too much chest. A neighbor murdered in a field because he brushed dirt off another man's shoulder. This wasn't random violence. It was maintenance, the constant upkeep of a fragile identity, like a fortress built of ice that could melt in a moment. And the price of neglect was exile, disgrace, or worse. Truth didn't matter. Evidence didn't matter. An accusation was a fire, and if you didn't stamp it out immediately, preferably in blood, it spread until it consumed everything you owned, everyone you loved, every right you had. Fathers killed accused sons. Brothers turned on each other. Men who had fought side by side in raids ended each other's lives in the dirt over a single word. The law hadn't just weaponized insults, it had turned an entire society into a self-policing machine, each man primed to attack at the first hint of weakness. It was efficient. It was merciless. And it meant that the man standing at the thing with his hand on his axe wasn't deciding between killing a man and sparing him. He was deciding between life and erasure. The crowd knew which choice most men made. The gods had set the stage for this madness long before any of these men were born. Every boy in the longhouses grew up hearing stories, by the fire stories meant to teach them courage, loyalty, and reverence for the divine. But those same tales carried another message. Stranger and more dangerous, the gods themselves broke every rule mortals were sworn to obey. Take Loki the trickster, who could change his shape and his sex as easily as breathing. The sagas told, without hesitation, how he once became a mare, lured a stallion away from a giant's work, and was mounted in the night. Months later, Loki returned to the gods not in shame, but leading his newborn foal Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that would become Odin's prized steed in Viking law. This was the ultimate humiliation for a man. In the myths, it was a triumph. Thor, the hammer-wielding god of thunder, had his own contradictions. There was the tale of the wedding, where he dressed as a bride veil, gown, jewels to fool a giant and reclaim Mjolnir. The same society that would kill a man for wearing the wrong shirt celebrated this story as cunning heroism. And Odin, all-father, master of wisdom and war, practiced satyr, a form of magic the Vikings themselves said was shameful for men. It was woman's magic, requiring the practitioner to submit to spirits in ways that mirrored the physical submission they so despised in mortals. By their own definitions, the chief of the gods was Ragnarr. Yet no mortal could claim that kind of license. The law was merciless: imitate the gods in these ways, and you would die for it. Even the rituals that marked life's milestones reflected this contradiction. On every wedding night, the groom would place Thor's hammer between the bride's thighs before consummation. Not a symbolic carving or a polished replica. The heavy, iron weapon itself, cold against her skin. While witnesses looked on, it was said to bless the union with fertility and divine strength. But the image was clear enough. Even the gods' blessings came in the form of penetration. The children who heard these stories learned early that, in the realm of the divine, sex could be fluid, violent, absurd, and without consequence. But in the human world, sex was a minefield where even an accident could kill you. This split reality created a kind of psychic tension, worshiping beings who defied their own laws. While living in a culture where stepping outside those laws for even a moment meant destruction, it was a tension every Viking carried with them, and it would seep into every ritual, every feast, every marriage bed. If the hammer blessing was unsettling, what came next turned marriage into public theater. Once Mjolnir had been pressed between the bride's thighs, the wedding party didn't simply leave the couple to themselves. They followed into the bedchamber. This wasn't intrusion, it was tradition. The room filled with voices. Older women sang verses that grew more explicit with every line, naming acts and positions in the bluntest possible terms. Men shouted instructions, laughing as they banged on shields and drums to set the rhythm. In some regions, the bride's mother guided the groom by hand, as if the couple were not newlyweds but actors in a ritual performance. The hammer remained on the bed, a cold weight between them, its presence making everything sacred and binding. The morning after, the witnesses returned, not with congratulations, but with scrutiny. The sheets were inspected publicly. They were not just evidence of consummation, but legal documents. Too little blood meant the bride was no virgin. Too much suggested violence. Semen stains in the wrong place could raise questions about the act itself. Inconsistencies could be grounds for annulment or future legal action. These sheets were sometimes stored for decades, ready to be produced in court if the marriage was ever challenged. They were, in effect, a couple's most intimate moment turned into a contract, written in blood and fluid. But the wedding was only the beginning of the community's claim on a couple's intimacy. At harvest festivals, entire villages took part in fertility reenactments. Selected couples would perform symbolic and sometimes actual couplings in the fields to bless the crops. Attendance wasn't optional. In some districts, the connection between gods, sex, and fertility was taken further still. Women were symbolically and in some cases legally married to statues of Freyr, the fertility god carved with an exaggerated phallus. These marriages were binding. The woman could not remarry a human man. During festivals, she would be required to perform ritual acts with the statue before the entire community. This was not satire, it was religion. The same communities that executed a man for an insult would gather to cheer as their neighbor performed with a wooden idol. In the Viking world, there was no contradiction in this, only continuity. The rituals of marriage and fertility were public because sex itself was never truly private. And the same hands that lifted Thor's hammer onto the bridal bed would soon be raising axes in judgment if a husband's shirt tore the wrong way. The longhouse was the heart of Viking life and the death of privacy. Picture it: a single room, 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, holding 3 generations of family, a cluster of slaves, the seasonal laborers, and the livestock. Horses and cows occupied one end, humans occupied the other. Smoke from the central fire pit filled the air, curling toward a roof hole that did little to clear it. The air was thick, stinging the eyes, coating the tongue with the taste of ash and animal. In that space, every cough, every shift of a blanket, every whispered word carried. A couple could not lie together without half the room knowing. For the wealthy, there might be woolen curtains hung from beams, thin barriers that muted sight but never sound. For the poor, there was nothing but the darkness. Winter made it worse. For 6 months, storms and deep snow kept everyone inside unless necessity drove them out. The same 30 people lived in the same stale air day and night, listening to one another breathe, cough, and groan. Newlyweds consummated marriages with parents lying an arm's length away. Children learned the rhythms of their parents' intimacy before they learned to read. In such a world, sex wasn't shameful, but performing it incorrectly was too quiet. And you were hiding something, too loud, and you were showing off. The wrong sound at the wrong time could start whispers that ended in legal ruin. Every groan, every gasp became part of a constant social audit. Slaves had the least protection. They slept near the animals, on bare earth, with no curtains at all. Their bodies were property, available to their owners whenever desire struck, often in full view of others. A morning's milking could begin with an owner taking a slave girl against the stall wall, while others pretended not to watch. To survive this surveillance, couples developed their own systems of signals. A certain arrangement of blankets meant ready. A single cough meant not tonight. A slow tap of the foot against the floorboards meant wait until they're asleep. These codes were passed between lovers like contraband, protecting moments of intimacy from an audience that could never truly be shut out. But there was no real safety. Those who overheard, willingly or not, could one day be summoned as witnesses in court to speak about what they had heard. A cousin's testimony about your lack of enthusiasm could decide a divorce case. A neighbor's recollection of your wedding night sounds could shape your reputation for decades. In the longhouse, nothing was ever truly yours, not your space, not your body, not even your most private moments. If the free lived under constant surveillance, the enslaved lived under something worse: absolute ownership. In Viking Dublin, the slave market opened almost every morning. By the time the sea mist had thinned and the gulls began their circling cries, platforms were already crowded with naked bodies. Men, women, and children stood shivering in the chill, eyes down, while buyers stepped forward to prod muscles, check teeth, and run calloused fingers over skin as if inspecting a new horse. This wasn't a hidden shame. It was an economic engine. At its height, as much as 30% of Dublin's population lived in chains. The pricing was methodical: 12 ounces of silver for a healthy adult male laborer, 15 for a young woman suited to household duties, and everyone knew what those duties implied. Children under 10 fetched 8 ounces if they had no visible defects. The records were meticulous: height, weight, age, the state of the teeth, visible scars, even guesses at virginity. Buyers had the right to examine everything, sometimes right there in public. If a woman flinched or resisted, it was a mark against her she might be worth less. Legally, slaves were not people. Killing one carried the same penalty as killing livestock: payment to the owner for the loss of property. Rape was not a crime unless it reduced the slave's value. The only real protection a slave had was their price tag. Viking raids fed the market with human cargo from every direction. Slavic captives so common their very name became the root for the word slave. Irish villagers, English monks, Scottish Highlanders. Traders assigned stereotypes to each group: Slavs for endurance, Irish for beauty, Scots for resistance to cold, English for their literacy. Prices rose and fell with these prejudices. But no matter the origin, once purchased, a slave's body was the master's to use. A man who didn't use his female slaves sexually was thought strange, possibly suspect in his manhood. The same laws that made free men kill over a torn shirt gave masters unlimited license over those they owned. For women, the nightmare was constant. They could be passed to a guest for the night as a gesture of hospitality. They could be forced to entertain at feasts in ways that had nothing to do with music or dance, if they became pregnant. The master might force a miscarriage through violence, or allow the child to be born only to sell it. And the psychological chains were as heavy as the iron ones. Many slaves served in the same houses where the warriors who had killed their families lived. Some were forced to tend to the very children of the men who had raped them. The sagas mention slave-born children casually, as if they were livestock foals, sometimes freed, sometimes sold, sometimes kept to be worked like their mothers. The Dublin market was efficient, regulated, and taxed. It had transportation networks that reached from Iceland to Constantinople. There were bulk discounts, specialized brokers, even standard guides for pricing. The brutality was made banal, dressed in the language of trade. And for the enslaved, death wasn't always an escape. Some would be buried alive with their masters to serve in the afterlife, their lives ending in ritual as cold and calculated as their years in bondage. The Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan had already seen enough in the north to haunt most men for a lifetime. But nothing prepared him for the funeral of a Viking chieftain. The dead man lay on his ship, surrounded by offerings, weapons, food, and the bodies of animals sacrificed in his honor. Beside them stood the slaves, each knowing what was coming. The question was not if one would die with the master, but which. The offer was made: who will join him in death. At first there was silence. Then a young woman stepped forward. Her life as a slave had been years of service, humiliation, and violence. Volunteering meant better treatment for her final days: rich clothes, strong drink, and a strange kind of honor. For 10 days, the camp prepared. They dressed her in fine garments, fed her until she swayed on her feet from mead, let her sing and laugh as if she were a bride, not a condemned woman. The fiction was deliberate. This was her wedding, and her groom awaited her in the afterlife. But before she could join him, there was a ritual no outsider could mistake for anything but violation. On the final day, she was led to a platform overlooking the ship. 6 men, the dead man's closest companions, stood waiting, one by one. They used her in full view of hundreds, each bending close to whisper the same line into her ear: "Tell your master, I did this out of love for him." This was not lust. It was duty, a grotesque form of tribute. The crowd watched in solemn silence, as if the act were prayer. Overseeing it all was the angel of death, an older woman whose role was both midwife and executioner. She guided the ritual, murmured reassurances, stroked the girl's hair. She knew the right amount of poppy juice to keep her compliant but conscious, the right words to make her accept what was happening as sacred. Ibn Fadlan recorded the girl's transformation from drunken bravado before the first man, to sobbing by the third, to silent, vacant-eyed stillness by the 6th. But the worst was still to come. The sexual ritual was only the prelude. The real sacrifice awaited in the tent where her master's body lay. She was led inside, positioned beside him as the men held her down. A rope looped around her neck. The angel of death drew a dagger and began stabbing, not to kill quickly, but to prolong, between ribs, into muscle, avoiding the heart. The rope tightened slowly. Outside, the crowd sang and beat drums, their noise swelling not to hide her screams, but to glorify them. It was believed that the greater her suffering, the more powerful the magic that would carry both her and her master into the next world. When it was finally over, her body was arranged in a posture of servitude beside his. The pyre was lit. Flames took both. The crowd cheered. Prayers were offered not for her peace, but for her service. Ibn Fadlan staggered away to vomit. The Vikings could not understand his horror. To them, This was beauty, sacrifice, and devotion. On the battlefield outside Uppsala, the snow was churned black with mud and blood. Among the fallen, one man still clung to life: Bjorna, a rival of the warrior Thoralf. Thoralf knelt beside him, in another world. He might have granted a clean death, but in the Viking world, there was a punishment worse than killing. He took his blade and carved, slow and deliberate, into the skin of Bjorna's forehead the outline of female genitals. It was called the skamhog, the shame stroke. It announced to everyone who saw it that the man bearing it had been used like a woman. The wound wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to be seen. To live with it was to live as something less than human. In the sagas, this was considered a form of creative warfare. The law didn't forbid it. In fact, it admired the psychological cruelty. Warriors who could invent the most elaborate or artistic skamhog were praised. Some carved realistic shapes, detailed enough for others to identify the anatomy. Others preferred abstract symbols that still made the meaning clear. The effect was instant and permanent. A marked man couldn't sit at the high table, couldn't join raids, couldn't swear oaths in court. His wife could divorce him without cause. His children could disown him. Some tried to hide their scars under hair or hoods, but concealment only confirmed the shame. Everyone knew what those marks meant. They were walking declarations of defeat. The flesh itself turned into public testimony. Over time, groups of these marked men gathered on the edges of society, living as outlaws in the forests, raiding travelers in settlements. In stories told to frighten children, they became monsters men, so shamed they'd lost all human feeling, reduced to savage, mindless violence. And it wasn't only warriors who suffered this fate. In legal disputes, a debtor who couldn't pay might be marked instead of executed. Pirates taken alive were sometimes cut with the shame stroke and set free, condemned to live in exile with the brand of humiliation. Women had their own versions of this punishment: symbols carved or burned into the skin of the hand or neck, marking them as sexually available to any man without legal consequence. The law considered this merciful. Death was quick. This was lasting. To the Vikings, leaving someone alive with a skamhog was not cruelty. It was restraint, a gift of survival that doubled as a lifetime sentence. It was one more way in which the Vikings perfected a society where the body itself could be turned into a weapon, and the scars told stories no one could ever erase. In most cultures, a love poem might win you a smile, maybe a kiss. In Viking Iceland, it could win you a funeral. Bjorn Arngir learned that the hard way. His verses about Thordis Grimsdottir weren't obscene, not in the way outsiders would think. He wrote of her thighs in the same breath as spring meadows, of her hair shining like fire at dawn. But in the Gragas law code, even this was criminal. The penalty for composing such man-sunger love poems about a woman was full outlawry. That meant anyone could kill you on sight, and no one would be punished for it. Writing that she has beautiful eyes was, in the eyes of the law, no different from theft or murder. The reason lay in Viking belief about words. To them, poetry wasn't just decoration. Words had power, literal and supernatural. A skilled poet could reshape reality. A love verse wasn't an expression of feeling, it was a spell, forcing desire into existence, bending the will of the woman, described. The paranoia went further. They believed a verse could affect a woman's body, praise her breasts, and she might feel them ache for the poet's touch, speak of her thighs, and they might fall open in longing. The better the poet, the more dangerous the magic. But it wasn't just about sorcery. A woman mentioned in a love poem became public property in the imagination of everyone who heard it. Her brothers, father, or husband suffered unbearable shame. Their female relative transformed into a shared fantasy. The only cure for that dishonor was blood. And so Bjorn's verses didn't just make enemies of Thordis's family. They lit the fuse on a feud that claimed lives with every stanza. Her brothers killed anyone who repeated the lines. Bjorn wrote more anyway. The death toll climbed. These weren't isolated cases. Sagas tell of Gunnar Haymundersson's compliments to Helga Longlegs, mild descriptions of her stride and hair that spiraled into a feud leaving 40 dead. The poems themselves were often clever, layered with double meanings. Your wheat field awaits harvest might mean exactly what it said, or describe something far more intimate. Listeners obsessed over decoding these layers, hunting for obscenity. If they found it or thought they did, the law didn't ask for proof of intent. The damage was considered done. In a world where a torn shirt could end your marriage, a single clever line could end your life. And yet, poets kept writing, knowing each verse might be their last, as if the act of speaking beauty into such a brutal world was worth the risk. If a single love poem could ignite a feud, imagine what happened when poetry became a weapon in itself. Some women, rather than hide from scandal, fought back with verse of their own or by commissioning other poets to do it for them. If a man shamed you in song, you answered with something sharper, filthier, more humiliating. What began as wounded pride often turned into a contest of obscenity. It could go on for months, even years. Families hired poets like warriors, not to wield swords but stanzas. Each new verse escalated the insult-mocking lineage, suggesting perversions, questioning manhood, and just as with steel, these battles almost always ended in blood. The Christian conversion made the game even more dangerous. Monks brought with them new poetic forms, richer rhymes, and a taste for double meaning. Poets learned to hide filth inside religious language. A stanza about resurrection might, to the wrong ears, be about something else entirely. Salvation became a euphemism for climax. A shepherd's flock could be a lover's bedmates. Soon, secret poetry societies formed circles of poets and listeners who met in hidden rooms. Trading verses too dangerous to speak in public, they memorized each other's work so that if one died, the poems would live on. The authorities treated these gatherings like criminal conspiracies. To preserve an outlawed poem was to share the guilt of its author. The saga of Cormac and Steingerd tells one of the bleakest examples. Cormac loved Steingerd, but her family refused him. He kept sending verses desperate, tender, and yes, sometimes pointed. Her relatives answered not with words, but with blades, killing his friends and allies one by one. Cormac answered with more poetry. By the saga's end, Steingerd was trapped in a loveless marriage, Cormac was dead in exile, and the feud had destroyed both families. The words had outlived them all. The law tried to crush this cycle, banning not just love poetry, but even praise of mothers and sisters. In some regions, a poem couldn't be spoken aloud without first being reviewed by a law speaker, but desire for verse was too deeply woven into the Viking spirit. They would rather risk death than let their tongues be silenced. For them, poetry was as much a weapon as the axe and no less likely to spill blood. In Viking law, marriage wasn't sealed with vows or blessings alone. It had to be proven, and not in private. On the wedding night, 6 witnesses would stand just outside the bedchamber, close enough to hear every movement, every sound. They weren't there by accident. The law required them. A marriage without witness consummation could be dissolved before dawn. The bride, perhaps only 15, would know her father or uncle was among those straining to catch each gasp. The groom, sweating under his wedding tunic, understood that too much noise, too little noise, or finishing too soon could all count against him. This wasn't just about performing for his wife. It was about satisfying the court before the court ever convened. The next morning brought the second trial. The witnesses would enter and examine the bed. They'd look for blood, for stains, for the right signs of struggle that suggested virginity. Too little blood could mean the bride wasn't pure. Too much, that the act had been violent. Either finding could spark legal trouble, but the scrutiny didn't end there. If a wife later claimed her husband neglected his marital duties, she could demand witnessed intimacy again. This time, it might be before family elders or worse, her own parents. The observers didn't just watch, they judged. Was there hesitation? Was the wife's response convincing? Did the husband's body show proper readiness? They would testify later, their accounts carrying real legal weight. In this system, sex became theater. Couples developed pre-performance rituals, invoking Freya for potency, drinking concoctions of herbs and honey. Women learned to vocalize in ways that would please the witnesses, even if it meant faking the sounds. Children grew up knowing their parents' sexual reputations from these testimonies. A boy might be told, "Your father lasted longer than most." A girl might hear, "Your mother's wedding cries were talked about for years." It was a world where your most private moments could be public record, preserved not in whispers but in official statements. And the wrong performance or the wrong audience could shatter your marriage before it had even begun. If a marriage faltered, Viking families had a remedy more humiliating than any public quarrel corrective witnessing. In this grim custom, a couple suspected of neglecting their marital duties could be ordered to perform under observation. Sometimes the witnesses were family elders. Sometimes they were the same people who had attended the wedding night. Failure in this setting didn't just invite gossip, it could end in divorce, property loss, or the forced return of a bride's dowry. The cruelty lay in the fact that this was not confined to newlyweds. A couple married for 20 years might be summoned to prove their intimacy again, with their adult children among the observers. Over time, couples learned to game the system. Wealthier households built acoustic chambers, small adjacent rooms with thin walls that amplified sound to the witnesses. Others staged encounters entirely, hiring stand-ins to make the necessary noises while the couple stayed elsewhere. Still, such deceptions were risky, if discovered. The shame doubled. Business alliances even adopted the practice, in some treaties. A marriage between two families was sealed by witnessed consummation, not just to bind the couple, but to prove the groom's virility before all parties. Likewise, certain contracts between men required that each demonstrate sexual adequacy to prove his worth as a partner in trade. The artifacts of these rituals took on lives of their own. The wedding sheets spotted with blood, sweat, and semen became talismans of legitimacy. Some families displayed them proudly, draping them where guests could see. Others locked them in chests, preserving them as legal evidence. There are sagas of inheritance disputes hinging on a 40-year-old sheet, examined in court by elders who claimed to remember the sounds of that night. When the Christian Church tried to outlaw such customs, calling them pagan indecency, the Vikings resisted fiercely. The compromise was confession newlyweds, describing their wedding night in detail to a priest instead of to witnesses. But, for many, this was no improvement. The words still carried the weight of law, and the same sheets still reappeared in disputes decades later. In a society where modesty could destroy you, yet sex was never truly private, even the sounds of a marriage bed could be turned into weapons preserved, recalled, and deployed years after the act itself. To a child, the autumn blot might have seemed like any other holiday music drifting from the tents. Merchants calling out over tables piled with honey cakes and dried fish. Dogs weaving between legs. But at the center of the festival grounds stood a platform no child could mistake for a stage. It was the Blodurn scaffold, its wood darkened by years of blood. By midday, a crowd had gathered, the smell of ale and roasted meat mixing with the iron tang of anticipation. The main event was the blood eagle, a form of execution as much performance as punishment. The condemned would be laid face down. The executioner, always a respected man of the community, would drive his blade into the victim's back, separating the ribs from the spine with slow, deliberate force. He would pull the ribs outward until they splayed like wings. The lungs were drawn through the opening, pale against the red. Points were awarded, yes, awarded for technique. A steady hand that kept the victim conscious longer was admired. A clean, symmetrical wing spread earned praise. The executioner narrated his work, explaining each cut for the crowd's benefit. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to see better. And this was only part of the spectacle, before the main sacrifice. Captured women might be paraded for bidding, not as slaves to be kept, but as festival property to be used by the highest bidder for the duration of the celebration. Survival often meant only a delay. When the festival ended, so did their lives. The gambling was constant. Bets on how many ribs would be broken before the victim passed out. Wagers on whether they would scream or stay silent. Even odds on the number of heartbeats between the first cut and the last breath. Women endured their own signature torments. In some rituals, masked men representing the god Friar would bless them in public, the act framed as divine possession. In others, they were tied to stakes, subjected to combinations of heat, cold, or animal attack. These, too, were wrapped in the language of worship. And through it all, the festival atmosphere never wavered. Merchants haggled over prices for wool and iron. Young couples exchanged vows. Children ran laughing past the platform, where a man's lungs fluttered in the air. the screams became part of the background, as ordinary as the music from the lyres. For the Vikings, these festivals weren't barbaric outbursts, they were vital acts of devotion. Pain was an offering, and the gods measured a community's worth by the depth of suffering they could produce. Cruelty in the Viking world wasn't uniform, it was regional, almost artisanal. Each territory had its own signature method, a grim calling card that drew spectators from miles away. In Uppsala, hangings were an art form. Victims were strung between trees or poles in elaborate arrangements, sometimes with weighted stones pulling their limbs into grotesque displays. In Trondheim, water was the weapon. Prisoners were held under icy currents until half drowned, hauled out gasping, then submerged again. The cycle repeated until the crowd was satisfied. Iceland's winter festivals perfected ice torture, captives stripped, bound, and left in the snow, while buckets of water were poured over them to freeze them in place, turning them into living statues for the duration of the feast. These specialties became points of civic pride. Hosting a festival with an especially memorable execution could enhance a community's reputation, attracting traders, warriors, and poets eager to witness or record the spectacle. Local executioners were celebrities, their skill in prolonging agony discussed in the same breath as a shipwright's craftsmanship or a warrior's battle prowess. Some victims weren't killed in one festival, they were kept alive for the next. These long-term captives were almost pampered, fed, well, given shelter, even allowed to heal from old wounds. The point was to preserve their strength so they could endure more elaborate suffering when the season returned. The kindness was a mask, the outcome was certain. For children, there was no separation between celebration and cruelty. A boy might learn to aim by throwing stones at a bound man. A girl might plait her hair with a lock taken from a victim. Body parts became keepsakes, fingers worn as amulets, hair braided into belts, teeth strung as necklaces. Warriors competed to claim organs thought to bring luck in battle, their worth measured in the blood price they'd fetched. When Christian missionaries recoiled at these rites, the Vikings were baffled. How else should a people thank their gods for a good harvest or a victorious raid? Mercy wasn't piety, it was negligence. Bad weather or poor crops were blamed on communities that failed to offer enough suffering. This worldview bred a resilience and a blindness. The child who watched a man's ribs torn open today would, in adulthood, carry their own son to see the same tomorrow, certain they were passing on tradition, not horror. In theory, Viking women had the right to divorce. In practice, that right was a maze lined with traps. The law allowed a wife to end her marriage for many reasons: violence, inadequate sexual performance, even cross-dressing. But she had to follow a ritual so precise that a single misstep would void the attempt entirely, and her husband knew it. First, she had to speak the formal words, "I declare myself divorced," from husband's name, while standing beside the marital bed, touching the exact spot where the wedding night consummation had taken place, not near it, not in the room, but on that very place. Many husbands, anticipating this, slept armed, daring their wives to try while they held an axe across the blankets. Second, she had to repeat the words at the main doorframe of the longhouse during a meal, with at least 5 adult witnesses present, again. Any deviation made the attempt invalid. Husbands avoided eating at home for weeks, or timed meals when her allies were absent. Some stuffed food into her mouth mid-sentence, knowing the law dismissed muffled words. Finally, she had to declare it before the public assembly in front of the law speaker and the gathered community. But her husband could block her attendance with legal excuses. She was needed for harvest work. She was sick. She was ritually impure. Each delay meant starting the entire process from the beginning. Witnesses were another hurdle. Each stage required different ones: relatives for the bed, neighbors for the doorframe, community leaders for the assembly. All risked the husband's retaliation. Some refused outright. Others accepted bribes to forget what they had heard. Timing was equally treacherous. Certain moon phases or festival days gave declarations more weight, but husbands controlled the household calendar, manipulating the dates to stall her progress for months, even years. Violence was always a threat. The law permitted a husband to reasonably discipline a wife attempting divorce. Broken bones, lost teeth so long as they weren't permanently crippling. They were legal. Only women with powerful families, money, and meticulous preparation had a chance. Gudrun, the daughter of a wealthy farmer, was one of those rare cases. She memorized every technicality, kept lists of witnesses, and bribed the right officials. On her third attempt, she spoke the words at the bed while her husband's warriors tried to drown her out with singing. She balanced on a honey-slick threshold while naming each witness at the doorframe, at the assembly. She produced receipts proving every household item she took was hers by right, shutting down his last accusation of theft. When she spoke the final words in public, the marriage was over. Her husband could no longer touch her without facing outlawry. She had won. But most women weren't Gudrun. Most never escaped. The law's pathways existed less as protection than as a cage with an open door placed so high and narrow that few could ever reach it. The longhouse was heavy with smoke and anticipation when Holgerd stepped forward. Her voice, sharp as the crack of an axe handle, cut through the murmurs. "He dresses like a woman," she said, pointing at her husband, Thorvald, showing his chest like a wet nurse. The room stilled. Everyone knew what those words meant. She wasn't just insulting him, she was invoking the law, turning a tear in a shirt into a weapon that could end his life as a man in the eyes of the community. Thorvald stood frozen. The rip had happened that morning while loading grain, an accident so trivial he'd barely noticed. But in Viking law, the sight of a man's bare chest could be read as unmanly display, and unmanliness was legal death. Holgerd wasn't improvising. She had prepared, one by one. She named the witnesses, locking them into the record. Bjorn Ironside saw the chest. Astrid Thorsdottir witnessed the shameful dress. Gunnar, the law speaker, observed the display. Each named witness stiffened. To deny her words now would be perjury, and perjury in this matter could carry its own ruin. The social fallout began before the trial ended. Thorvald's brother shifted away from him on the bench, unwilling to share the shame. His trading partners turned their eyes to the floor, already severing ties in their minds. Even his mother, gray-haired and stooped, turned her back. Then came the property division. Holgerd claimed her dowry and mourning gift. She added compensation for the emotional damage of witnessing his effeminacy, supported by testimony about other alleged incidents, a shirt torn last winter, a cloak worn too loosely. By sunset, Thorvald had lost almost everything: land, livestock, standing in the thing. His unmarried sisters would now struggle to find husbands. His nephew's apprenticeships were canceled. But the deeper blow was social. No one would trade with him, drink with him, or even take his charity. A man marked by unmanliness contaminated anyone who touched his life. Holgerd, meanwhile, emerged transformed, no longer just a farmer's wife. She was a strategist, a master of sexual law. Other women sought her counsel, men, even powerful ones, kept a wary distance. She had shown how a technicality, a tear in cloth, could be sharpened into a blade. That day, the longhouse wasn't just a place of judgment, it became a proving ground for a new kind of power, one that didn't swing an axe, but killed reputations just as cleanly. Thorvald left before nightfall, stumbling through the mud with only a bundle of clothes, the longhouse door closing behind him like the lid of a coffin. No one followed. His name would live on. But only as a warning, a story whispered to boys about the danger of letting your shirt tear in public. Holgerd stayed, her place at the fire suddenly larger. People spoke to her differently now. Women leaned in to ask about the exact phrasing she had used, the timing, the choice of witnesses. Men kept their greetings polite and brief, wary of what else she might know about the law's sharper edges. This single accusation, absurd to modern minds, was a perfect mirror of Viking sexual culture, a world where the same society that worshipped shape-shifting gods would execute a man for a soft voice, where law demanded witnesses to a couple's first night together, but banned love poetry as if it were a weapon, where rape of slaves was sanctioned as hospitality, yet a torn shirt could dismantle an entire family. The contradictions weren't flaws, they were the system. Every ritual, every restriction, every brutal punishment was part of a structure that turned intimacy into law, law into spectacle, and spectacle into survival. Archaeologists keep unearthing the evidence-scarred bones, Mass slave graves, wooden platforms stained dark from repeated sacrifices. The sagas, once thought to exaggerate, now seem restrained compared to what the ground gives back. The most disturbing truth is how normal it all was to those who lived it. Children learned early that suffering could be sacred, that privacy was dangerous, that a body theirs or someone else's was never entirely their own. The extremes didn't feel extreme, they felt like tradition. And so, when the smoke in the longhouse cleared and Thorvald was gone, nothing else changed. The meals were eaten, the fires stoked, the law recited. Life went on in the Viking way, where the wrong word, the wrong gesture, or the wrong tear in a shirt could end you, and where ritual murder was just another day in the life of the gods' chosen people.